chat. With that, it's almost 2:05. I'm going to turn it over. The recording has started, and I'm going to turn it over to Hope Jensen from FTA to give us greetings. Hope?
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to FTA's Key Procurement Deficiencies webinar. Today, we'll focus on two aspects of procurement with FTA funds: how to prevent key procurement deficiencies and procurement aspects of FTA's COVID-19 supplemental funds. We have a lot to cover, so as Denise said, put your questions in the chat. We'll do our best to answer them. And so I will turn it over now to Denise to start the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Hope, and welcome everyone. My name is Denise Bailey from Milligan Consulting, as Hope said. And as she also noted, we're going to cover a couple topics today. The first, highlighting some key areas of deficiencies that FTA has seen in their oversight programs. And we're really going to look at three aspects of that. First, what are the requirements or regulations that run behind these deficiencies? Second, what's really driving these deficiencies for recipients based on our experience? And then we're going to unpack some suggestions or tips to help you prevent and avoid deficiencies like these. At the end of the program, we're going to do a high-level review of some of the procurement aspects of spending some of your FTA COVID-19 supplemental funding. As this slide states, nothing in today's webinar is going to create any new requirements or regulations. Rather, we highlight existing requirements and regulations and offer some suggestions and recommendations for improving your procurement. And so we hope you view today's webinar keeping that in mind. FTA provides a number of oversight roles. Some of the key components are listed in the middle of this page. Many of you may be familiar with FTA's comprehensive reviews. They also go by the name of QuarTAP reviews. Some know them more commonly as triennial or state management reviews. Those reviews occur every 3 years for the majority of FTA's recipients. They're really forward-looking in nature, and FTA's goal is to try to make sure that as you're implementing your programs, you stay in compliance with a number of the regulations. FTA also uses this time to assess how you're managing your FTA programs and how you're implementing the programs that its funds are supported. Those are different types of reviews in FTA's Examples of those are financial management oversight reviews, or FMO reviews, procurement system reviews, which we draw heavily from today. And there are a number of other reviews, such as those in the civil rights areas, ADA, disadvantaged business enterprise, equal employment opportunity, and Title VI. Those reviews are different because they occur at FTA's discretion. And so you may not predict that you're going to get one, and there may be no set period of time if you've gotten one where you may get another one or a follow-up review. While procurement is one area in the comprehensive reviews, the procurement system reviews, as this last bullet says, focuses specifically on a certain area. So FTA specialized reviews go very deep in the area in which the subject of the review is about. On the next slide, we show what FTA has running behind a number of its reviews. These are its contractors' manuals. On the left-hand side is the screenshot and the URL address for the current QuarTAP contractors' manual. On the right side is a shot and a link to FTA's procurement system review manuals. Both of these manuals are now consistently formatted. So if you haven't looked at the PSR manual in the last couple of years, you might be surprised to know that it looks very similar in format to the QuarTAP manual. While procurement is one area, as I said before, of the triennial and state management review, it's the sole focus of a procurement system review. Some of the key differences of a PSR versus a QuarTAP review is that, of course, we take a larger sample size of procurements to review, and we ask more questions. And so it is a deeper review of the procurement system and of the procurement documents and files. So what does the PSR cover? There are 22 questions or elements of the review for a procurement system review, starting with number 1 being procurement policies and procedures and ending with number 22, efficient and economic purchases. The ones that we've underlined on this slide are the ones that we're going to focus on today. We always recommend that you don't wait until it's time for your core TAP review or your procurement system review to familiarize yourself with what might be asked during those reviews. And a great way to do that is to maintain currency on the contractor's manuals that we gave you links for. Even if you don't have a triennial review coming up, it's a great self-assessment tool for one area or for other areas. All right, so let's look at some deficiency trends in the procurement area. What we have as we lead into that area is a poll. The slide is just saying what the poll questions are. For most of you, poll number 1 should be popping up soon on your screen for you to answer. And so just wait a second, it's popping up now. So answer this question. I think deficiencies in the procurement area are approximately what percent of all triennial review deficiencies. So if you have the poll pop up in front of you, go ahead and select your answer. If you don't, we've just provided the questions for you so you know what everyone else is looking at. From time to time, if you're using a phone or your system is blocking some of the poll features, you may not be able to actually take the poll. But we didn't want you to miss out. Once the number of folks have answered, we will end the poll and share the results. All right, so most of you said about 25%, and the second highest vote was for 20%. So let's look at the answers. So thanks everyone for sending in your response. So as you can see, most of you were correct. Of all the areas, and we only show 5 of the over 20 areas that a triennial review covers, procurement is still number 1 and not in the best way. It is the number 1 area of deficiencies consistently in FTA's program. But there's good news in this data. Some good news is that on balance, deficiencies are decreasing in this area. And so that's a trend that FTA would like to continue to see. Also, some good news is what FTA looks at in a cohort perspective. So a cohort is if you had your triennial review in 2015, you're in the group of recipients that got their next triennial review in 2018. And so you can see the cohort deficiencies from 2016, same set of folks for 2018, are also trending down. Same as for 2018 to 20. And so for 2 reasons. One, because FTA recognizes that procurement is still a high area of deficiencies, and because they want to keep the downward trend going, FTA has designed this workshop, this webinar today, so that you can become more informed about things you can do to prevent deficiencies. So let's look at what we're going to spotlight today. There are 5 broad areas that we're going to cover: independent cost estimates and cost or price analysis, responsibility determinations and suspension and debarment, clauses and certifications, 2 big areas, Buy America for rolling stock, and subrecipient oversight. So why did FTA pick these 5 areas to focus on? Well, it'll come as no surprise that a number of these are the areas that are yielding the highest numbers of deficiencies. And not just overall number of deficiencies, but as the second bullet says, a high number of repeat deficiencies. So a repeat deficiency is if you had a triennial review in 2016 and you had a deficiency in independent cost estimate, and then your next review was in 2019 and you had that deficiency again, even for a different procurement, FTA tracks and records that as a repeat deficiency. Another area is that some of these are high areas of risk for both the recipient and FTA. And so that's why they've determined to focus on these 5 areas for this webinar. So let's get into it. Independent cost estimates and cost or price analysis. For those of you not familiar with the Procurement System Review Manual or the CORTAP Manual, what we're doing is taking you through a couple of sections of those guides. So it will help orient you when you use those manuals in the future. So the relevant question in the Procurement System Review and in the Triennial and State Management Review is P10 or Procurement 10. The question simply is, does the recipient develop independent cost estimates and conduct cost or price analysis as described in his procedures and for every procurement action above the simplified acquisition threshold? So in procurement, you have to be really on your toes with the thresholds. So for independent cost estimates and cost or price analysis, that is really gauged by the simplified acquisition threshold. That number in, I would say the past 5 or 10 years has been on the move. It currently sits at $250,000. And so as reviewers, that's where we're really looking to see that you've done an independent cost estimate. And then when you get bids, a cost or price analysis. So underneath each question in a triennial review or procurement system review are what we call indicators of compliance. So there are two that we look at for this deficiency. One, did you develop an independent cost estimate before you received bids or proposals for every procurement above the simplified acquisition threshold? And indicator B is, did you conduct a cost or price analysis for every procurement of that same size? So that's really what we're looking for here. But before we get into some of the drivers, we're going to take another poll. So poll number 2, if you could answer that, true or false question. And here it is arriving on your screen. An independent cost estimate needs to be dated, sorry. And ICE must be dated. So we acronym independent cost estimate, like many things, to ICE. So true or false, if that has to be dated, answer, hit submit. And when a number of you have answered, we will share the results and move on. So I'm really pleased to see that the vast majority, and thank you for ringing in true for those of you who aren't able to do the poll. We will see the answer, but because I'm happy, I think you know what the answer was. So what really drives deficiencies? One common area in procurement and independent cost estimates and cost or price analysis is no different. One driver is that recipients misclassify procurements as locally funded. This can often occur if you're part of a state or local government, so you're part of a city, a county, a state, and somebody outside the transit arena is conducting procurements for you. Quite often, federally funded and certainly FTA funded procurements aren't their normal bread and butter of procurements to put on the street. And so it may just be misclassified and a number of the federal requirements haven't come along with it. Another reason is that you don't conduct it when it's applicable. So you just didn't do it even though you had a procurement that was over $250,000. This internally can happen sometimes if you have decentralized procurement and you have folks outside the normal procurement arena that are able to conduct procurements, or as important as the regulation says, procurement actions. So an important aspect of that requirement is that FTA considers a change order to be a procurement action. And so you need to be aware of anybody who might be conducting these procurement actions because they need to follow the requirement to conduct an independent cost estimate before receiving bids and a cost or price analysis after receiving bids or proposals. A third driver is that, and this is quite common, is that it was conducted but not documented. And so oftentimes things in procurement come down to documentation. FTA is aware that many agencies shifted to virtual and remote and shifted to electronic documents, and many are still in that space. And so there's no requirement that it has to be on a piece of paper, but you need to be able to provide that documentation, not just for reviewers, but also to serve the purposes for which they were intended. The next common deficiency, and we don't like it when we see this, is that an independent cost estimate was documented, but really dated after the receipt of bids. So an independent cost estimate is really what you think the bids are going to come in at before you receive the bids or proposals. It really serves as the starting point for you to do a cost or a price analysis. So continuing with some of the drivers is that you may not provide adequate documentation for what was the source to support your independent cost estimate. It may just be a number in the file. So you should provide a little more information about what you're basing your independent cost estimate on. When necessary, there's no evidence that the ICE was factored into a cost or price analysis. Certainly when we do a procurement system review, if your independent cost estimate was much lower or very much higher than the actual prices or bids you got in, then we would expect that there would be some documentation in the file of how you considered, was that price still fair and reasonable? It's not a deficiency if your independent cost estimate was flawed in some way, but FTA would expect that you would examine that and understand what is the difference between the price you expected to get and the price or cost that you actually got. Another area of deficiency is that a cost analysis was required, but you did a price analysis. So cost and price analysis are different. There's a cost analysis and a price analysis. It's easier to talk about a price analysis. Price analysis is most common where there's competition. So you have 3 or 4 vendors that submitted a bid, and you're able to look across from them and do a price analysis among them. A cost analysis is done primarily in instances where there's not competition. So for example, when you have a sole source procurement or a change order, or in instances where you've asked for your those instances, you would actually be evaluating the cost element that led to whatever the top price was. And so make sure that you have a good grounding in independent cost estimates and on cost or price analysis. So if those are the drivers, what are some of the things that you can do to help prevent these deficiencies? Well, first, we are big believers in checklists and standardizing processes. So you could include the completion of an independent cost estimate and a cost or price analysis in a procurement checklist that's guiding your procurement. Now, everyone should be doing their own checklist. And so while it might be fine to use an example of a neighboring agency, you really want to understand what the requirements are for your agency and the way you're organized, and really develop a good checklist around your procurements. Another good idea is to develop a standardized format to use for independent cost estimates and for cost or price analysis, so that no matter who in your agency is conducting those, they're done in the same manner with the same level of information. There are a couple of good resources we've noted on this page. One is FTA's Best Practices Procurement and Lessons Learned manual. It's not a manual that's full of requirements, but it is a manual full of good ideas and some best practices. And they include in that, especially in section 4.6, some sample forms and checklists that you may want to look at and perhaps adapt and adopt for your agency. FTA also has a pricing guide for FTA grantees that can give you more insight in how to evaluate price and cost. And so that's independent cost estimate and cost or price analysis. Continue to put your questions in the chat, because we will take a look at them and answer them as we can at the end of the webinar. So the second area is responsibility determinations and suspension in debarment. That is covered under P4 in both the Procurement System Review and the CORTAP Contractors Manual. So the question here simply is, do you make awards only to responsible contractors as described in policies and procedures and in compliance with the requirements? For this question, we're looking at, again, two indicators. Indicator A, do procurement files contain documentation that you made a written responsibility determination before you entered into a contract prior to award? Also, prior to award, did you get assurance that the third-party contractors are neither suspended or debarred from federal work? So before we get into some of the drivers, we are going to take another poll. So poll number 3, you'll see pop up in a minute. And this asks, for what methods can you use to document that contractors are not suspended or debarred? So you have 3 options, and the 4th option is any of the above. Go ahead and submit your answer. All righty. So let's look at, we'll hold the real answer until we get to the next slide. All right, so what drives deficiencies? First, when we're talking about responsibility determinations, it's really a lack of consistency or documentation when determining responsibility. FTA doesn't believe, nor have they seen, that there are wide numbers of recipients awarding contracts to contractors that aren't responsible. What they have seen, though, is a lack of documentation that that determination was actually made prior to award. And so the regulations talk about 4 things that you should be looking at: the integrity of the contractor, their compliance with public policy, their past performance, and their financial and technical resources. So depending on the size, complexity, and type of procurement, this could be a very long determination or an abbreviated determination. When you look at suspension and debarment, the real drivers of deficiencies here is that you haven't documented, again, that you have made that determination for every contract of $25,000 or more. And so that's a pretty low threshold. So that's one thing that trips some recipients up. So you do have 3 options as the answer to the question. You can pick one or more of these options, but you have to choose one. The first is the inclusion of a clause in the contract that lets contractors know they cannot be awarded if they're suspended or debarred. The second is the collection of a certification attesting to the same thing. Or the third, which is actually the preferred method for FTA and the one they wish you would use, which is actually checking sam.gov prior to award for any of those excluded parties. And so you can check any 3 of those. The challenge is that many recipients do choose the third option, which is available to them. It is, however, the option for which there's little or no documentation unless you screenshot that or unless you note on, say, a file checklist the date that you checked sam.gov. So those are the real drivers of deficiencies in this area. And so again, because most of you are actually doing this, this is low-hanging fruit for eliminating deficiencies by just getting the documentation a little better. So what can you do to prevent these deficiencies? So first, use a standardized format to determine if the contractor has the appropriate financial and technical resources for the type of procurement you're looking to award. Do they have a good track record? The next 2, some folks struggle with, what does it mean? So record of integrity, such as not being debarred or suspended, either locally or federally, could be an input into integrity. Compliance with public policy, such as all the things they certify to in your procurement. Are they in compliance with Buy America, with the disadvantaged business enterprise requirements, those types of public policy issues? And so if you use a standardized format in your agency to conduct these, then you may have a better consistent way of demonstrating compliance. For SAM.gov, because so many of you use the check of that system, and I've seen some folks don't like the new way that the system is formatted, you need to just make sure there's some documentation that you conducted that prior to award. All right, so next section, clauses and certifications. So this actually encompasses two questions of the PSR manual and the Quartat manual. Question 11, do you include applicable federal clauses in FTA funded procurements exceeding the micro purchase limit and construction contracts over $2,000? So again, be very aware of thresholds, especially for clauses and certifications, because they really apply based on the type of contract and the size of contract. And well, why construction is really spelled out here is because of requirements such as Davis-Bacon that go down still to the $2,000 threshold. So it's very important that you stay up to date in that. The next is, did you include the required certifications? Did you receive signed certifications? And did you make sure that they were in compliance with what they certified to? So let's look at the indicators of compliance. For P11, very simple. Did you include the applicable clauses? And we'll talk about what those clauses are in a couple of minutes. P12, we're really looking for three distinct certifications as applicable. First, did you include the DBE TVM, not ticket vending machine, but transit vehicle manufacturer certification in solicitations? Did you receive signed certifications? And did you verify that they were in good standing? So for TVM, this doesn't apply to all rolling stock. It applies to vehicles that are manufactured for transit purposes. So for instance, buses, trains, cutaways are manufactured specifically for mass transit purposes. Items that you get off the lot, such as sedans and other support vehicles, maybe for your fleet, or unmodified 10-passenger vans, are not considered TVMs. The verification that we're talking about here is making sure that you check FTA's DBE website to make sure that your bidder actually is signing those in good faith. So it's really called trust but verified. Indicator B, did you include lobbying certifications in solicitations over $100,000? So that does not follow the simplified acquisition threshold. That's still at $100,000. And the Buy America certification for procurements over $150,000, that included iron, steel, or manufactured products. So that's a little more deeper dive on those three certifications that we're looking for. So what drives these deficiencies? First, again, recipients don't realize that a procurement is FTA funded. You know, a number of the deficiencies in the clause arena is not because recipients missed one clause or two clauses. It's they didn't have any of the federal clauses in their procurement documents. And this quite often can happen if someone forgot that it was an FTA funded procurement. In a few minutes, when we talk about the FTA COVID-19 supplemental funds, we'll also talk about another driver under that first bullet, which is many of you historically have not used operating funds from FTA or received them. And now, because of the COVID-19 supplemental funds, most recipients are accessing operating assistance and using it for procurements. And so you need to make sure that you bring those procurements back into the federally funded fold for processing. The next area of drivers is just lack of consistency. And so again, this could be a decentralized issue within an agency where one part of your agency may be using a good checklist, but other folks may not. Another area for lack of consistency in this area is for those of you who have subrecipients, making sure that when they're spending your FTA money on procurements, that they're including things such as clauses and receiving certifications in. Another driver is that an unanticipated high bid or increased contract cost could kick you up over one of the thresholds for which you should have collected or may need to go back and collect these certifications. This is another good reason to have a good ICE or independent cost estimate. A good ICE will help you target which of the clauses and certifications are required for each of the procurements that you put on the street. Drivers for certifications are very interesting and different than clauses. We have seen, unfortunately, that when you get certifications back in, they may not be signed, they may be incomplete, or they may indicate that the vendor is both going to comply or not comply with the requirements. And so it's very important that you read those certifications and not just pencil check that you received a certification. Please read what's on them. Some recipients require a signed certification, but rely on the vendors to actually generate what that certification looks like in lieu of actually sending it in the solicitation. We have seen signed certifications that were not received at the time of bid, but sometimes after that. And we have seen quite often that there's been no verification against FTA's website for the TVM certification. So those are some of the common drivers. So what can you do to prevent deficiencies in this area? First of all is use a clause and certification checklist. So for clauses, right now in the triennial review area and the procurement system review area, we are looking at maybe a smaller number of clauses than you're used to in the past. A TVM is a transit vehicle manufacturer. I saw that one flash up. We are not looking at the longer list of clauses that you may be familiar with in the past. That doesn't mean that these clauses or certifications are not required. It just means that these are the ones that FTA is focusing on. The ones that we're focusing on are primarily the ones that are in 2 CFR 200, which is contains the overarching procurement requirements under Appendix 2. We also have a clause checklist that feeds off of that we use in the procurement system review in the contractor's guide within section 11. FTA's master agreement also from time to time changes and includes additional items that you need to put into your third-party contracting agreements. And so we recommend that every year you get a copy of the latest master agreement, look at the summary of changes, and see if there have been any new requirements that may impact your procurement process. The master agreement is dated October 1st of every year. Sometimes it's published a little after that, but each year FTA provides an amended master agreement that all recipients are bound by. Another tip is to develop a method for identifying FTA-funded procurements, both across departments and with others that may sit outside your department. So there should be some indication whether this procurement's moving along in paper or electronically, some flag that this is an FTA-funded procurement so that everyone's aware that an independent cost estimate has to be done. These clauses and certifications need to be included for a number of items. And of course, as I said before, there's no substitute for reading those certifications once they come in to you. All right, so we're going to go to the next area, which is Buy America for vehicle procurements. The relevant question here is P20. If you're purchasing rolling stock with FTA funds, did you comply with the requirements of 49 CFR 663, including pre-award and post-delivery Buy America audit requirements, inspection requirements, and purchasers certification requirements? So we're going to take the fourth poll here, the fourth and final poll here. And that question is going to be, are Buy America audits and certifications the same thing? So when that poll pops up, go ahead and select your answer and hit submit. All right. So I'm happy that most people know that they are not the same thing, because knowing that will help prevent a lot of deficiencies in this area. But let's look at the indicators of compliance. So for these indicators, looking at indicator B and indicator C under this question. Indicator B is for rolling stock purchases. Did you conduct pre-award and post-delivery audits to ensure the manufacturer complied? And indicator C, different indicator because it's a different requirement. Did you document those audit functions were done by completing and maintaining written certifications? So they are two separate requirements. So what drives this deficiency? So well, one thing that drives deficiencies in this area is that many FTA recipients use FTA funds for rolling stock. And so the potential for deficiency is there when you're purchasing rolling stock with FTA funds. Another driver is that you don't make the internal file documentation that you actually conducted the pre-award and post-delivery audits. And so you didn't actually realize that what you were supposed to do was to also do a certification of that. And the third is that somebody outside the procurement office may have done these operations, and maybe the signed certifications are out there somewhere, but they can't be located. This is quite common in post-delivery. Pre-award, the procurement office is still usually very close to the procurement, and so the pre-award certifications typically are easier to find. Post-delivery, when the vehicles are delivered to your agency, quite often that's someone in operations or maintenance or someone at one of the garages that's actually doing that that audit and certification, and either they didn't do the certification or the paper just hasn't gotten its way back to the procurement office or in any filing system that can be located. So what can you do to prevent this deficiency? So some of it is all about understanding what you're supposed to do. As reviewers, we're looking for really 5 certifications. We're looking for 2 at the pre-award stage and 3 at post-delivery. So at the pre-award stage, you need to conduct the Buy America audit and sign a certification that it's in compliance with Buy America. That sub-bullet notes that this is not what is provided by the manufacturer. What you're actually doing pre-award is saying, okay, here's the vehicle that's being proposed, and here is how the vendor says that this vehicle that they think they're going to send you meets the Buy America domestic content and final assembly requirements. You review that, make certification to the file that you believe it's in compliance with Buy America. The second is to make sure that the vendor identified that they were going to be in compliance with Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Specifications, FMVSS, from the standards from the manufacturer. And then you need to review the proposed vehicle specification, say, yep, that is the type of vehicle that will meet my needs, and then sign a certification to the file that you reviewed the vehicle being proposed and that will meet your purchaser specifications. So 2 certifications pre-award. Post-delivery, similar activities again. Now for the vehicle you got, the components and subcomponents will probably be different than the one that was proposed. So again, you look at the information the manufacturer has given you and you sign a certification that the vehicle that was delivered met Buy America. Same thing for FMVSS. Look for the sticker of FMVSS on the buses, make sure it's in compliance, sign a certification to the file that it's in compliance with FMVSS. And the third is when you get the vehicles in, inspect them, road test them, make sure it's the vehicle that they offered, and you sign an internal certification that it meets purchasers' requirements. Another great resource, and FTA's website is chock full of good resources, is shown here on the screen. And the URL is at the bottom, and that is FTA's Buy America Handbook, really the how-to guide for conducting Buy America audits, but also contains checklists and sample forms and certifications for you to use during that process. Internally, what you can do under that first bullet is make sure you know who's going to be doing the pre-award and post-delivery audits and who's going to be signing those internal certifications. Make sure you develop a retention policy for where no matter who does the certifications, these documents, after they're signed internally, are going to reside. And so those are some tips for helping to prevent deficiencies in this area. All right, so the last area of deficiencies that we're going to cover is subrecipient oversight. So the relevant question here is, do you perform oversight of your for their FTA-funded procurement activity? So first of all, it's important for you to understand if you have subrecipients. Quite often, if you're in the procurement office, you may not be that familiar with whether or not your agency has subrecipients in its FTA program. These are not subcontractors, these are subrecipients. So these are outside entities that you give a portion of your money to, or you pass through a portion of your money to, and they stand in your shoes and spend that money on the needs that they have for the portion of transit that they're supplying for you. Of course, state DOTs, by and large, have the lion's share of subrecipients, but a number of other agencies that are not state DOTs have subrecipients also. So it could be important to check with the grants folks in your agency. Another good way to find out if you had subrecipients in the past is to read one of your last FTA oversight reviews, because in the beginning, under the description of the grantee, they often note whether or not there are subrecipients at that recipient's location. And so a good thing to know is, do you have subrecipients to begin with? Two indicators that are driving these deficiencies. First is, do you implement oversight procedures of your subrecipients? And B, is that oversight adequate? And so we're really going to look at the adequacy of that by looking at some of the procurement files that you had already reviewed to see if you caught or would have caught what we did when we looked at a same procurement that you have already reviewed. So what drives this deficiency? So first, it's opportunity, right? It's if you are a recipient that has subrecipients that use your funds to purchase items with, then you have a higher potential for having this deficiency. Some agencies have decentralized oversight, or oversight that's not comprehensive, or it may not be existent at all. And so you really need to see, if you have subrecipients, what is your oversight procedure and policies? And specifically for this area, what is that for procurement? And so you need to really understand what is going on with your oversight. A lot of agencies do oversight, and it kind of comes down in that third bullet to documentation, making sure that you document that you have done that oversight. If you have issues during your oversight reviews of your subrecipients, make sure that you do follow-up of those open findings or deficiencies. It's not a deficiency if you found something at your subrecipient and have worked to correct it. There is a reason for oversight. And so FTU won't be surprised if your subrecipients don't get a 100% passing score, but they are going to want to see that you've done what you can to make sure that deficiencies are corrected and they don't happen again. Another, next to the last driver, is that the oversight procedures or checklist are not updated as procurement requirements change. And so looking at the master agreement every year, grabbing a copy of the triennial review and or the procurement system review every year to see if there are any new changes in the procurement area in particular that you may want to look to your oversight procedures and update is a area I think that could help. There are also complications when subrecipients are direct recipients of FTA. And the complication comes in the light of, if I have a subrecipient and they also have a direct relationship with FTA, I might incorrectly assume that FTA is going to review their procurements for you. For procurement, for the funds that you gave them, FTA is looking to you as the recipient of those funds to perform the oversight in the area of procurement. And so make sure that you don't pass along the money and pass away the requirements also. So what can you do to prevent this deficiency? So create a comprehensive standardized approach. Include procedures from question P21 of the PSR or CORTAP manual. We have a sample of that we've turned into kind of a checklist on the next slides. When regulations change, review and revise your oversight guides. Document that you've done not just the oversight, but taken the corrective measures, and follow up with your recipients to make sure that the next time you come out, you don't have the same deficiency also. So at the end of the procurement section in both the PSR guide and the triennial review guide is this oversight question. And it's P21. You know, it's not just procurement. In almost every area of the triennial review, there is a question that is asking about subrecipient oversight. So you can use that manual too globally to help inform your oversight. But specifically for procurement, what we're going to want to see is all the questions that we asked you directly. We're going to want to see if you ask the same questions of your subrecipients. And so the first ones are system-wide. Do your subrecipients have written policies and procedures? Do they have standards of conduct? Do they have protest procedures? Those are kind of system-wide elements. And then what we do as a reviewer, you see our own instruction, is we select one procurement that you've already reviewed and check all of the things on the remainder of this slide, everything from responsibility determinations to cost or price analysis, and continuing on the next slide. And so you can create a checklist for your subrecipients, and a good starting point is what we are asking of you as far as your oversight of them. Many of you have other state and local requirements and other things that you follow up on your subrecipients. And so you could use this as a good base to start from for building that type of information. Some overall tips for preventing procurement deficiencies. Review past areas of deficiencies, not just in your state or triennial review, but also if you've had a procurement system review. Fun fact, the financial management oversight review also does have a few questions related to procurement. And if your agency has had a disadvantaged business enterprise or DBE review, then they may also have had some deficiencies that are procurement related. And so it's a really good piece of advice to look back in your past reviews and see where you had issues before to make sure that the procedures that you said you were going to put in place were put in place and that they're actually having the desired impact. I said before, have a system for identifying FTA funded procurements just to make sure that everyone is on board with what's FTA funded and what is not. Checklists to standardize compliance are always a good idea. Document your internal processes. Make sure that you have a way, if you've changed a process, and many of you have gone to an electronic process, that you've updated your processes to be in line with what you're currently practicing. Make sure you thoroughly review everything you get in from the vendors, and especially certifications, to make sure that they are certifying appropriately. There's some tips also for policies and procedures. First, make sure that your policies and procedures cover 2 CFR 200.318 to 327. Those are the overarching procurement requirements for federally assisted procurements. But there are other procurement related requirements, such as the Buy America regulation, the DBE regulation. And so make sure that your policies and procedures are comprehensive. The next is to update them, especially when requirements change, your processes are modified, or relevant sections of the master agreement are revised. Make sure also that you train anyone who touches procurement in those policies and procedures. That not only includes procurement personnel, but contract administration folks, project management folks. It extends out to your DBE folks to make sure that your policies and procedures are not the elf on the shelf, but actually a document that folks understand and will gravitate to in order to guide their procurement processes. So now we're going to end just with some high level information about COVID-19 supplemental funds in FTA. As most of you are probably aware, there were three big funding acts that were passed. The first, March of 2020, was CARES. That gave $25 billion to transit. The second is CRISA, which was the supplemental act in December of last year, $14 billion. And the most recent was March of this year, the American Rescue Plan Act, which gave $30.5 billion to transit. FTA has an awful lot of good resources for the supplemental funding. First, on the left-hand side is the landing page where you can find out all kinds of information, details on the acts that were passed, other information, including what we've highlighted on the right, which are the coronavirus frequently asked questions. And so we would recommend that you bookmark these as some of your favorite places because these FAQs in particular are updated from time to time. They really contain questions that your peers or yourself has asked and FTA has provided some guidance and direction on. There is not a procurement section of the FAQs. Quite often answers to procurement questions are in other sections of the FAQs. So what we've done on the next slide is assembled a number of those questions and answers and information just so you had a good overview and that you'll go back to those sites to look for more. The first point is that all 5307, even those in large urbanized areas, 5310 for CRISA and ARP only, and 5311 recipients were eligible for operating assistance at 100% share. So what that means, especially for the large urbanized, is that for years they had not gotten operating assistance. And if now you're receiving operating assistance, you need to make sure that you recognize those procurements as FTA funded. There were some flexibilities that were built in also. The second bullet, under certain circumstances, administrative leave for maintenance and operations contracts is eligible if it wasn't eligible before. It did allow you to modify contracts to pay for eligible operating maintenance expenses so that you could retain readiness or eligible fixed operations and maintenance expenses. It also said that you could funds could be used for operation and maintenance expenses incurred after January 20th, 2020, even if that original contract was not actually procured meeting all the federal requirements. New contracts, however, need to follow all federal requirements. And the last one wasn't any new flexibility, but a number of recipients asked about the ability to sole source items with their COVID-19 supplemental funds. Some of the common things that were asked about were personal protective equipment or PPE. And FTA reiterated that 2 CFR 200.320 already permitted you to use non-competitive or what's commonly called sole source procurement for emergencies or public exigencies. And so no new flexibility there, just reminding folks that you always had that ability to do it. Of course, if you do a sole source procurement, just some food for thought, you need to put a justification in and do a cost analysis. So it doesn't relieve you of those requirements, but it did remind you that those were avenues that you had available to you. FTA has a lot of resources, many of them internal. The first is to make sure that you are grounded in the regulations for procurements with federally assisted or federal funds. That is 2 CFR 200.317 through 327. So please make sure you're aware of that. There's a link here to FTA's current master agreement. Like I said, the master agreements change every year. They're updated every year. There's a procurement resources portion of FTA's website that has good information. We've already mentioned the best practices procurement manual. National RTAP has a procurement pro software that can get you started on a procurement and can help you get a good foundation. Of course, you always have to tailor all of your procurements to your own needs, but can really give you a good foundation for building your procurement. Of course, the National Transit Institute offers a number of trainings in the procurement area. And there is a webinar similar to the format of this one on FTA's website. That one was specifically about calculating, documenting, and charging operating expenses. And so that could be a good webinar too if you're new to receiving operating assistance or you're not, because it's applicable to both situations, whether you just started receiving operating assistance or you've received it throughout your history. Some real good information about the financial side of that. And so that is really the questions and answers section coming up. So I'm going to go into the chat and I'm going to start looking at the questions. If you have any questions, please continue to put them into the chat and we'll try to answer as many as we can. There's a question about if after checking SAM and they are debarred, does SAMS provide another documentation that we can provide the contractors? I haven't seen any additional one, but as we all know, sam.gov is changing. And so I would stick with that. FTA doesn't actually run sam.gov, so they're a consumer of sam.gov as we are. Checking through for the next question. For an ICE, is it required for each procurement with federal money or any procurement, even if it's privately funded? When we're looking at these, we're looking at FTA funded procurements when we're doing our reviews. And so the requirement for the independent cost estimate comes from 2 CFR 200. And that really the headline for that is procurement requirements for federally assisted projects. Question, is an independent cost estimate required for a sole source procurement? Yes, an independent cost estimate is required for every procurement, comma, over the simplified acquisition threshold. So it really depends on, for us looking at it, the size of the procurement, not really what type of procurement is. So even if it is a sole source, and maybe almost most importantly, if it's a sole source, you should have a good idea of what the costs are going to be so that when you get the cost estimate in from your vendor, you have something to analyze it against. The question is, what's the difference between an ICE and a cost analysis? So an independent cost estimate is what you do internally to identify what you think the cost of the procurement is going to be before you even get bids in. Once you get bids in, then you would either do a price analysis if there's price competition, or cost analysis if there was no price competition, if there was a sole source, if it's a change order, or if you ask for elements to be costed out in a certain manner. So ICE is something you do internally before you get bids and proposals. Cost analysis you do after you get those bids or proposals in to analyze whether or not that's a fair and reasonable price. Question is it correct that the entity who did the ICE cannot be the one who receives the contract in the bidding process? Right, the ICE is done internally. The independent cost estimate is not done by your bidders or proposers. It's done internally so that you know what, or you think you know what prices you're going to get when they come in. Questions about, does an ICE have to be signed? Does it have to have a wet signature? I think a lot of requirements for wet signatures have gone have been relaxed with COVID. So there's no regulation that says it has to be signed. As reviewers, we would like to know who did the cost estimate. As a best practice, is good, at least in a memo form or in a template, identify who in your agency did that. But there is no requirement, and certainly not one that we check for in a review, for a wet signature internally of who actually did it. We would like to know who, and of course, the date tells us that it was done prior to you receiving bids or proposals. A question about responsibility determination: should a no results found printout be included with the file? So there's a question about, okay, so I do a SAM.gov search for suspension and debarment. What's the type of documentation that we're looking for? If you look in the contractor's manual, there are a couple of things that we would like to see, one or the other. One is a printout. And so you could do a print screen, even though, hopefully it was no results anyway, so they're not suspended and debarred. But, we've even seen where folks have a checklist that record the date, who, and the URL address for what you searched. So some sort of documentation that you searched it. Should the SAM check be included for every contract action over $25,000? And so the regulations say every award of over $25,000. So, a couple rules of thumb. First, definitely if it's a new procurement, we do want to see that you've done it over 25,000. It's an indicator we did not get into, but if during a contract you find that a contractor has become suspended or debarred, so they were fine when you awarded it to them, but at some point after that they became suspended or debarred, you have some options. You can terminate them, you can continue to use them, but you can't add funds or extend that contract. And so another good rule of thumb is, before you exercise an option or do a big change order, you might want to look at sam.gov again, just to make sure that you have all the options available to you as they are in the regulation. I'm just scrolling through the questions, so just give me 1 second. So there's a question about, are certs and assurances document required at the time of proposal? So certifications and assurances, as we talk about them at FTA, is something that recipients sign as in TRAMs as a part of their grant approval process. If you're talking about the 3 certifications that we talked about in this presentation, TVM, which is Transit Vehicle Manufacturer, Lobbying, and Buy America, those need to be signed and sent in with their bid. They're called a condition of responsiveness. And so you need to get them with the actual bid or proposal, and they should be signed at that time. And so make sure that you have your checklist up to date, so that if a vendor needs to submit, say, a Buy America certification or TVM certification, and they don't, that's actually likely a non-responsive bid, because all of those certifications are as a condition of bid. And so that answers, there are a couple of questions about, can we get certifications signed after the bid? So you need to really read the regulations that run behind them, because, for instance, the TBM says as a condition of bidding, which tells you that you need to have that signed document back when they submit their bids. That is not, you can't let it go on to right before award. The question is, are we required to obtain copies of subcontractors' contracts to verify that the prime contractor included FTA clauses and certification, or can we just get a statement from the prime that the subs contracts do include the FTA clauses and certification? This is an area that FTA doesn't review a lot, and so it's not a standard review that we will go down and look underneath those, but you have the responsibility to ensure that your prime contractors are compliant with your requirements. And if some of those requirements require that those certifications be passed down and those clauses be passed down to subcontractors, you should have a contract administrative policy and procedure to, as we say, trust but verify that those are actually in compliance. In DBE reviews, we very much look at subcontracts because there are a number of items that need to be flowed down from the DBE regulations. And so it is an effective practice. And the one way that you can be sure that those are being flowed down correctly is to have a process to look behind them and check them. For TVM certifications, what happens if the manufacturer is outside the United States? Is DBE applicable here? And so for TVMs, that's transit vehicle manufacturers, this is a part of the DBE regulation. The requirements are that as a condition of bid, the manufacturer sign that they are in compliance with the DBE regulations. And what that really means is that your manufacturer has submitted their DBE program plan, their goals, and their reports to FTA, and FTA doesn't have any issues with the manufacturer's DBE program implementation. And so the way that you verify that that vendor has been through that process is not just collect that certification from them, but on FTA's DBE website, there is a listing of the TVMs who are in good standing with FTA. And so receive that certification. It doesn't matter where the manufacturer's from, they still need to be in compliance with the federal regulations. And so they should be signing that certification. And if they've signed that certification, you should be able to go to FTA's website and see them in that section. And so make sure that you've taken that separate step also. There's a question of what's the definition for rolling stock. So depending on which requirement you're looking at, when you're looking at Buy America, there's a different definition. There's a different definition for transit vehicle manufacturer. So you really have to look at under which instance you're using the term rolling stock, because sometimes it's called revenue rolling stock, sometimes just rolling stock. And as we discussed in the DBE, it's transit vehicle manufacturer. So we can't answer that question broadly because depending on, what the root of that question is, there could be a number of correct responses. Regarding subrecipients, is there a comprehensive list of all FTA clauses that flow down to the vendor level within the clause language themselves? And so on the, if you were in 2 CFR 200 Appendix 2 and you were looking at the clause, when you actually look into the clause information itself, you will see what the requirements are for flowing that down. By and large, most of those requirements flow down, but within the actual clause itself, the requirement that drove that clause will give you information most of the times about how you flow it down. So FTA doesn't have a comprehensive one that flows down to all subrecipients. It really depends on the type of procurement, the size of the procurement, and what you're buying. And so each of those clauses and certifications have certain instances where they are applicable to be flowed down. But, a federally assisted contract is a federally assisted contract, whether or not you put it on the street or your subrecipient. And so anything that would apply to your procurements would by and large apply to any federally assisted contract that your subrecipient is putting out. There was a DBE question here that says the FTA approved overall DBE goal. It's a 3-year goal, not an annual goal. Can this be obtained by issuing separate contracts throughout the year if needed, or each contract? So your FTA approved 3-year goal is covering your procurement activities for that 3 years. That could be one or a number of contracts, depending on how many federally assisted contracts you put out on the street. And so it could be, if you have an overall goal of 10%, you may have some contracts that have a 0 contract goal, a 10% contract goal, a 20% contract goal. It is not, your overall goal is really an aggregation of all your projected contracting activities. The next question is, when will the federal clause Appendix A from the Best Practice Procurement Manual be updated? We don't have any information on that. There's a question about NTI procurement courses. We don't have information on that, but I know that they're doing a number of their courses virtually. So I would recommend continuing to go back to their website and check for them posting new websites, either virtually. They have not gone back in session yet, from what I understand. And we are at the time limit. And so I think that's all the questions and answers that we can do right now. We've captured all the questions in the chat, and so your question has not been forgotten. If it wasn't answered, I apologize. I answered as many of them as I could in the lightning round. We'd like to thank you all for spending a part of your day with FTA and learning more about procurement, and hopefully finding ways to prevent and avoid deficiencies in the future. Have a safe remaining part of your week and the rest of your day. Bye.